the winter. And I think that a lot of people get really stressed out about like what to do. Oh, it's getting cold. Like, what am I supposed to do to the plants? Everything's gonna die. And to be honest, if you left the garden alone, it would be fine, and the plants would be fine. But there are some things that you can do at this time of year to make the garden better. So if you don't do anything, don't stress out. Like the garden's gonna be fine. But I'm gonna give you a few tips that I always do when I'm taking care of different gardens around the city, um, to kind of just help the plants and help the garden. Um, so I think the first thing to do is if you have an irrigation system, you should consider blowing out the irrigation lines with compressed air. I don't know if anyone here in the meeting has an irrigation system, but that's something I always do. And I always recommend that people put in irrigation systems. I think it's like if you're going to spend money on the garden, I think that's the number one thing you should do. And Jennifer is saying, how do you do that exactly? Install an irrigation system or blow out the lines? To blow out the lines, you need an air compressor, which you can get. Okay, so to blow out the lines, you can get an air compressor at any hardware store. And the air compressor, you get special fitting that connects to the end of the irrigation pipe. And so you unscrew the irrigation pipe from the water connection, and you screw it, and you'll see water kind of spitting out of the little holes or emitters in your irrigation system. And you keep the air compressor running until you don't see water coming out of those holes anymore. So that's how it's pretty simple. So yeah, the first thing, that's my first recommendation, is to blow out the irrigation lines. My second recommendation for anyone to get their garden ready for the winter is to use an anti-desiccant spray. I don't know if you guys have heard of that before, but I always use anti-desiccant sprays on broadleaf evergreens. So what's a broadleaf evergreen? Rhododendrons, acubas, camellias, all of those shrubs that have leaves that stay green all year round. Boxwoods, different types of holly, ilex. So if anyone has broadleaf evergreens, it's a really good idea to spray this anti-desiccant spray, which is basically, it's organic. It's made out of pine. It's like made out of pine sap. And basically the spray forms a waxy coating on the leaves to protect them from losing moisture in cold winter winds. So if you don't spray the plants, sometimes in the really cold weather, the leaves will kind of turn brown and shrivel up because they get fried by the cold wind. But if you use this spray, which forms a coating, it will protect the leaves. Someone's saying you can buy hand pumps to winterize RVs. Yeah, I guess so. I've never tried that, but I would try anything once. So yeah, anti-desiccant spray. The type that I use is called Wilt Proof, WILTPRUF. And I mix it with water. On their directions on the bottle about the ratio that you should mix, but I mix it with water and then spray all of the broadleaf evergreens. And that's something you can keep doing periodically throughout the winter, like once a month. So blow out the lines, spray anti-desiccant spray. Those are the first two things. The third thing that I do, so the third thing I want to talk about is whether or not to cut back your perennials. And this is something that I saw in the questions that were submitted to Dorothy. There are kind of two camps here. Some gardeners say, yes, in the fall, cut back all the perennials, clean up the garden, clean the leaves, make it clean. No one wants to see a mess all winter. And there's another group of gardeners that say you should don't cut any perennials, don't clean up any of the leaves, leave everything wild until the spring. And when you start to see growth from the perennials, that's when you cut. And you guys might be thinking, like, what am I supposed to cut? So basically, the herbaceous perennials push up a lot of growth and they can get tall, like Some perennials get 3-4 feet tall. And after they're done blooming, when it gets cold, they'll just turn brown. So you'll have all these like brown sticks all over the garden, basically, and it can look ugly. So I'm kind of on the fence about whether or not you should cut and clean or leave everything wild. Here's why. If you leave everything wild, you provide a lot of habitat for different beneficial insects and pollinators and caterpillars that'll turn into butterflies. And all those insects, they can live underneath the leaves, or they'll live like at the base of a grass plant where they're protected and insulated from snow and cold rain. And it just provides them habitat in your garden. But again, it's messy. If you have rats, maybe the rats feel comfortable hiding underneath the leaves and all of that stuff, because we're in the city and people have rats. And another reason to clean up the garden is like so I work at the Old Stone House as the gardener there. And last year we decided to cut everything in the fall just because we didn't want to have a mess all winter long. Trash can get blown in and get stuck in the plant material. So we decided to cut everything just to kind of keep things looking neat. But I know, for example, like at the High Line, they don't cut anything until March because they want to provide as much habitat as possible. So it's basically kind of up to you. And then if you are a bulb planter, if you plant bulbs in the fall that are going to flower in the spring, maybe you want to clean up a little bit now so that you can actually get into the garden to do your planting. Does anyone have any questions about that?
So it sounds like you're saying it doesn't have as much effect on the health of the perennials, whether you cut back in the fall or clean up in the spring.
In my opinion, it doesn't have an effect on the health of the plants.
Okay.
Although it is good to have some kind of cover. I don't like to leave bare soil in the garden beds. I like to have some kind of mulch layer, whether that's like a light layer of leaves or some wood chips that you buy. I think it's good for the garden. I don't like to have bare soil exposed all winter long. Okay. But there are some gardeners who do. There are some gardeners who say, clean it up. Or some clients that I have that just don't want mess. They just like everything clean. So.
Okay. Thank you.
So let's see. Moving on to the next topic that people were asking about in the questions was, so another thing I do at this time of year is bulb planting. So I don't know if you guys plant bulbs in your gardens, but I love growing bulbs. It's like a great thing to have in the spring when it's still cold in March and you're so tired of the cold weather and you just want it to warm up. And then all of a sudden you see little crocus popping up out of the ground, and it just kind of like, it always makes me really happy. So when I plan for bulbs in gardens, I try to plant a lot of different types of bulbs, because then all spring you'll get a succession of different bulbs that bloom. So crocus are the first ones to come up, and then daffodils come up after that in April. And then after daffodils come up, the tulips come. And then after the tulips, the alliums start to come up. So if you plant 4 different types of bulbs, the bloom time of the bulbs will be from like February all the way until May. So that can be kind of cool. However, I also saw in the comments that people were asking about squirrels digging up the bulbs. So some bulbs are more tasty than others. So in general, squirrels love tulips. They're really sweet, I guess. I don't know, they taste good. So if you have squirrels, maybe don't plant any tulips. But daffodils, they say, are supposed to be poisonous, different types of narcissus. Daffodil is another word. Narcissus is a Latin name of daffodil. So they say that they're poisonous, and the squirrels don't bother them as much. I think it's also about trial and error. Maybe try some this year and it doesn't really work. So next year you try something else. And in order to, when you're buying bulbs, don't just buy like 5 or 10, buy like buy them in the hundreds. You really want to have like a mass of bulbs. So like at the old stone house, we just got a shipment of 1,200 bulbs, which probably, to be honest, isn't nearly enough. But that was like the maximum I could get. So that's what we have. And when you're planting the bulbs, sometimes I'll dig a big hole and I'll plant different types of bulbs together in the same hole. When I'm planting bulbs, I never plant just one bulb per hole, unless it's like a huge bulb, like an allium. Sometimes alliums are like the size of a softball. So those can go on a hole by themselves. But for the smaller bulbs, you can throw like 9 bulbs in the same hole and put odd numbers of bulbs in each hole. That's when most gardeners lay out their gardens, we tend to work in odd numbers, just because I'm more of like a natural style gardener. And so when you're using odd numbers, it feels a little more natural to me. And then another thing when you're planting bulbs is always use fertilizer in the hole. So there's a type of fertilizer that's specifically blended for bulb planting. It's called bulb tone. It's an organic fertilizer. So put a little handle of fertilizer in the hole with your bulbs. And then some people like to plant bulbs in containers, and I've had mixed results with that. So and the reason I've had mixed results with that is because of freezing and thawing that takes place over the winter. So sometimes in December, we'll have a couple of days where it's like 50 degrees, and then the temperature drops really fast and the soil freezes, and then it thaws again. And when that happens, the bulbs can be heaved up out of the soil. And then they're like sitting kind of on top of the soil because of that freezing and thawing process. So sometimes planting bulbs in containers doesn't work. The bigger the container, the higher success rate. So if you're planting bulbs in a small container, it's less likely to work. Another thing about planting bulbs in containers is they're susceptible to rot when they're planted in the container. So that's something to think about too. And what else do I have to say about bulbs? If you're buying bulbs, there's a great website called Brent and Becky's, which has a huge selection. And they have like anything you could possibly think of. And another thing about planting bulbs is it's okay to plant them close to existing perennials that you have in your garden beds. And in fact, it's good. Like if you have plants in your garden that bloom later in the season, it's actually a really good idea to plant bulbs really close to those plants, because late blooming perennials in general don't come up haven't come up, I should say, when the bulbs are blooming. If that makes sense. So go crazy with the bulbs. Let's see. Another thing I would like to touch on is about planting. If a lot of people, I think a common misconception is that the only time to do planting is in the spring. But in my opinion, I think that fall is a better time to plant. And the reason is when the temperatures are dropping, the soil temperatures are still warm. So even though the air temperatures get cold fast, it takes much longer for the soil temperatures to catch up. So that means that if you plant in the fall, the roots of the plants are really nicely insulated. And when it rains in the fall, the soil stays moist for a long time. So the ground is insulated and moist, and the roots are just super happy. So all winter long, the roots are getting comfortable and they're starting to put out a little bit of new growth. And in the spring, you already have a strong root system. And so the plants just kind of take off from there. Whereas if you plant in June, it's like the plant is just kind of trying to survive through the hot weather, and it's not really able to put out a lot of new root growth. And you're going to have to water that plant like all the time, all through July and August, to just kind of keep it alive. So fall is awesome for planting. Another reason fall is a great time for planting is because most nurseries don't like to hold inventory over the winter. So sometimes you'll find like great deals on plants, because nurseries just, let's see. And when you plant in the fall, it's still a good idea to fertilize. Whenever I plant, I always put some fertilizer in the bottom of the hole and kind of mix it in. Or if you want to use compost, mix, or both, fertilizer and compost mixed into the bottom of the hole, and then you plant your plant. And this goes for trees, shrubs, and perennials. It's a great time to plant any of this kind of stuff. And make sure that you're watering your plants in after you plant them, as always. And another question in the comments was about how to protect your plants over the winter. So I already touched on the anti-desiccant spray, the wilt-proof, but another good way to protect your plants is with burlap. So if you live in a really windy location, like if you have a Japanese maple on a windy terrace, it's a great idea to get some burlap and wrap the tree with the burlap. So you wrap it around the trunk, and then you go to each individual branch and wrap it around the branch. I like to use zip ties to kind of secure everything on. And it just kind of is like a nice thing to do for your trees. And especially plants that are not quite hardy in our climate. Like a lot of people like to grow figs. We're in zone 6, zone 7 here in New York City, but a lot of figs are only hardy to zone 8. So we're kind of like on the border. And by the way, I don't know if you guys know what zone means, but it's basically the USDA, based on climate conditions, has broken down the US into different garden zones, which is the measure of the lowest average minimum temperature in the winter. So basically, the lower the zone number, the colder it is in the winter. So like Alaska is probably zone 1 or 2, and then you get down to Miami and it's like zone, I don't know, 12 or 13 or something. So anyway, if you have plants that aren't quite hardy in our zone, it's a good idea to wrap them in burlap. Or if you just in general, if you have a really, really windy location, maybe you could, sometimes what I've done in the past for different clients is we'll make like a screen made out of burlap on the windy side of the terrace to kind of block some of those really cold, whipping winter winds. And you can get burlap. If you're getting burlap, get the thick stuff. Sometimes at Home Depot, they sell the really cheap stuff. It's like thin, and get the thick burlap if you can. And then another thing I'm always doing all fall is cleanup. And what to do with all of the leaves. It's kind of, especially if sometimes I wish I lived like upstate somewhere where I could just had a pile in like the back corner of the forest and I could just dump all the leaves. But here we don't have that privilege. So what to do with the leaves? I know that the city has started up the composting program again. So if you get some brown bags or clear bags, the city should be collecting leaves and sending them for compost. But then again, like they're not doing it in every neighborhood, and who knows? That's option one. Another thing that you can do is this is a little bit like, I don't really expect anyone to do this, but I'll just mention it anyway. They have machines that chop the leaves. It's like a leaf chip. It's like a wood chip machine, but especially made for leaves. And basically, if you chop up the leaves, the volume of the amount of leaves declines drastically. So if you have a yard and clean up the leaves, 10 bags of leaves would go down to 1 bag of leaves if you were using this leaf chopper. And then you use those chopped up leaves as mulch on top of your garden beds. And that way all your paths are clear, your seeding areas are clear, but you've used all the leaves that fell on paths and seeding areas to mulch. Have a leaf chopper, that's something you can do. You rake up all the leaves from your paths and your seeding areas and use those leaves as mulch in your garden beds. I think leaves make the best mulch for borders. And when I say borders, I mean like your garden area. What else? And then if you do composting in your backyard, I know some people do, you can also save those leaves in bags and incorporate them into your compost pile to add some carbon into your compost system. And another thing that I've seen people do, if you have a lawn, I've seen people make a pile of leaves and then run the lawnmower on top of the leaves, and that does a really good job of chopping them up too. But it's like wear your mask because it's just dust everywhere and it's kind of a mess. Let's see. And then another thing, storing non-hardy plants. So someone was asking about elephant ears in the comments, that they saw someone's house that had elephant ears. So if you have a place to store plants that aren't hardy in our zone, definitely dig them up now and save them. So here's the process. Like this goes for canna lilies, it goes for dahlias, elephant ears, caladiums. Basically, if you have any of those types of plants growing in the ground or even in a pot, you can dig them up, cut the foliage off the top, lay them out to dry, and then shake after they've dried for a couple of days, shake the dirt off, and then wrap them in newspaper. And the newspaper will kind of keep them from losing too much moisture over the winter. And then you also need a place to store them. So if you live in a place that has a basement, the basement is a really good place to keep them. A lot of New York City apartments get really dry as soon as the radiators kick on. And it just sucks all the moisture out of the air. And then if you're storing your non-hardy plants in newspaper, they'll just shrivel up because the air is dry. However, if you have a basement that's not heated, most of the basements will stay at like 55 degrees all winter long, and that's the perfect temperature to keep that kind of stuff wrapped in newspaper. So yeah, let's see. I'm trying to work through this, what I wanted to say quickly so I can get to your questions, because I see there's a bunch of questions down here. So I'm gonna try to move a little quicker. But I hope what I'm saying is useful, and maybe I'm telling you something you hadn't heard before. Okay. Preparing your pots for winter. So plastic pots, leave them outside. They're probably not going to crack. Same goes for styrofoam, fiberglass, metal, all that kind of stuff can stay outside. If you have terracotta pots, what I usually do is empty them out, and you can just kind of stack them up somewhere in a corner, and they probably won't crack if they're empty. But if they're full of soil, again, the soil is going to freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, expand and contract. And in that process, your terracotta might crack. And then in general, when you're buying pots, make sure that they're frost resistant. That's so like sometimes you'll see a tag on there, or you can ask the person who's selling it to you. Anyway, let's see. And then pruning in the fall. People were asking in the comments about their big hydrangeas. So in general, as a general rule of thumb, you prune after bloom. So when your hydrangea is done blooming, you can cut it back pretty hard. And that's not like a blanket rule, because there are different types of hydrangea, but that's usually what I do. Is when they're done blooming, you can prune them pretty hard, and you can take out all the spindly small branches. You can cut off those dried out flower heads unless you like them. Some people like them. And those dry flower heads, you can also bring them inside. They make nice dried flower arrangements. And another thing that I like to prune in the fall are roses. Especially climbing roses can be cut back really super hard this time of year. So that's kind of like, I just kind of went through my list of all the things that I like to do when I'm doing a fall visit in one of my clients' gardens. And so now, Dorothy, should we look at the list of questions?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Somebody wants to know what to do with their lavender and rosemary. Can those stay in the ground over winter?
Okay, so lavender and rosemary, it's kind of sometimes they survive and sometimes they don't. My favorite type of lavender to grow is a type called phenomenal, which is really good for our hot, humid summers and tends to do well over the winter and has a pretty good survival rate. But you can't, like last year, I left the rosemary in the ground, and even though we had all that snow, it still survived. So yeah, why not leave it in the ground?
Okay. Okay, you got the potted tree question. It sounds like you recommend mulch covering for gardens over the winter.
I do.
Okay. Let's see, wrapping shrubs. Somebody wants ideas of recommendations of smaller trees to plant.
Recommendations for smaller trees to plant. And so again, I know it's hard to say without knowing what the growing conditions are. Is it shady? Is it sunny? Is it like, does the soil drain well? That kind of stuff. But here are a couple small trees that I like to use. Starting with Amelanchier, which has edible berries. It's great if you have kids, and because I think it's always cool for kids to see plants that they can eat. I also really like Styrax trees, which is a fragrant snowbell. I like to use Japanese maples, which tend to stay pretty small. What else? For evergreens, I love camellias. I mean, there's a million things. It's hard to say.
Okay. Okay. Is there a source this person could look at or a book that you would recommend? Because they know their conditions. Is there a place where they could go to say small tree for part shade?
Yeah.
Somewhat dry.
I really like the Missouri Botanic Gardens website. Has a really good resource guide for different trees. And a book that I really like for trees and shrubs is by Michael Durr. His last name is spelled Dirr. He has the best book about trees, woody plants, basically. And I really like his books because in the back of the book, the back of the books are full of lists. Like, if I want a tree that has blue flowers, he'll give you like lists of 10 plants that have blue flowers, and then list like 10 plants that have purple flowers, and then a list of 15 plants for small trees for a shade garden, and then 15 plants for salty soils, that kind of thing. So Michael Durr and the Missouri Botanic Garden website both have great resources.
Great. Okay, thank you. That should help a lot of people. Pruning a young but healthy overgrown fig tree and blueberry bushes.
So with blueberries, there are a lot of different types of blueberries. Some blueberries are called high bush blueberries, are meant to get very large. Okay. And there are some dwarf varieties. So it's hard to tell you how to prune without knowing like the exact type. But basically, if the plant is in your way, if it's like drooping into your path or your seeding area, cut it so that it's not in your way. If it's just reach the berries, yeah, they're pretty tough. They can take it. And then a large fig tree, same thing. With the figs, I think it's best to wait until late fall to do this type of pruning. So wait until the tree has dropped its leaves, so you can kind of see the structure of the branching, and then prune it. Is if the tree has leaves on it, and this goes for like hydrangeas too, and a lot of like different types of trees, it's much better to wait until late fall, until after the plant has dropped its leaves to prune, and because that way you can really see the architecture of the branching.
Okay. Suggestions for improving a grass lawn.
So it's suggestions for improving a grass lawn. So this time of year, it's good to aerate the lawn. So which means to like punch holes in it to introduce some oxygen into the soil. And it could be that the lawn is really compacted. So you want to kind of get that air into it to loosen it up a little bit. You can add some kind of top dressing, like some kind of sifted compost that has some organic matter to introduce to the lawn, some fertilizer, and then lay out some seed. And then it's a good idea to put something on top of the seed so that the birds don't eat all of your seed, because about half of the seeds are for you, and I can assure you that the birds are going to eat the other half. So maybe you get a light layer of straw to put on top of it, or you could use the top dressing on top of the seeds. Just so yeah, aeration, fertilization, add organic matter, and plant seeds. And another, I will say about grass seed, a lot of the grass seed that you find at Lowe's or Home Depot or different garden centers is treated with an antifungal coating. And it's really bad to breathe that stuff in. So wear a mask and wear gloves when you're spreading that seed. It's like a bright blue coating. So just be super careful. Wash your hands afterwards, because there's a lot of nasty chemicals on a lot of the grass seed that is being sold.
Thank you. What my question? I got lost. When to fertilize trees and what to use?
Okay. So when to fertilize trees, you can fertilize them. Spring is a really good time to fertilize them. And I like to use, there are a lot of different, it depends on the tree, to be honest. But any organic fertilizer is pretty good. Like an all-purpose type of fertilizer. There's one called Healthy Start that I really like. But make sure you know the type of soil that your tree likes. So some plants like acidic soil. So for those plants, get a fertilizer that adds a little bit of acidity into the soil. So do your research about the type of growing conditions that the plant likes. And if you fertilize first thing in the spring, it'll kind of give the plant a boost throughout the growing season.
Okay. You already talked about squirrels a little bit. They like tulips. They don't like daffodils. So somebody wants to know how to keep squirrels from digging holes and stealing bulbs. I guess one answer would be to plant daffodils, not tulips.
I mean, how to keep the squirrels from digging holes? That's a tough one. I've seen people get creative with like different types of wire mesh. I've seen people who are really crazy sit out there and clap at them and yell, and it's in my opinion, it's just something that you kind of gotta like put up with. It's hard to get rid of them. And they actually in the gardens that I've worked in, they dig holes and it's annoying, but they don't really damage the plants that much. They're not like looking to eat the plants like a lot of other pests. They're kind of like rooting around for nuts and stuff, and they usually don't find anything, and they'll abandon the hole before it's too big. So to be honest, I'm not usually too concerned about squirrels. They don't bother me that much.
Okay. Good. A couple questions about geraniums and in general, how to prepare tender plants for winter. Somebody has geraniums in the window box, and Susan actually has some geranium cuttings from her mother-in-law in Michigan, and she's wondering what she can do with those until the springtime.
Okay, so let's see. If you have geraniums in a window box, you could dig them out of the window box and repot them and bring them inside and keep them in a sunny windowsill all winter long. Mm-hmm. That's what I would recommend. To be honest, geraniums they're not like the most expensive plant. I know everyone's on a budget. However, like if you buy a geranium plant in the spring, it's like $4 or $5. So if it was like some rare plant that's really expensive, then I think, yes, it's definitely worth the trouble to bring it inside and wrap it up and lay it in the 55-degree basement and everything. But for a geranium, maybe it's okay to just buy a new one next year. If you have cuttings, keep the cuttings rooted in water, however you're rooting them. And then once they start to sprout roots, stick them in some soil and keep them in a sunny windowsill all winter long.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Can I plant tulip bulbs in pots and leave them out on the deck over the winter? Any particular size pots? And it sounds like you covered this in the beginning. What's the smallest pot that would work for bulbs over the winter?
I would say the smallest would have like a 12-inch diameter. That's the smallest I would do it. Anything smaller, again, the heaving and the thawing and the freezing it won't be great. But however, I think that the joy of gardening comes from experimentation. So like, I don't know, just because I said it doesn't work doesn't mean that you shouldn't try it. So I've tried a million different things. I've killed a lot of plants. A lot of what I've done has not worked, but just kind of like have fun with it and experiment. And if you have a beautiful pot, but it's less than 12 inches and you really want to grow tulips in it, give it a try, you know?
Mm-hmm. Okay. One more tulip question. Is it bad for trees if you plant tulips in a tree pit?
No.
Okay.
Plant them in a tree pit for sure. Definitely plant in the tree pit. And in fact, when you plant them, you're going to be adding fertilizer to the bottom of each hole, which is also going to be benefiting the tree. So yeah, go for it. It's not bad for the tree pit at all. You might be like disturbing some of the roots of the tree when you're planting. That's inevitable. But with large established trees, the amount of damage you're doing to the surface roots probably isn't going to affect the tree that much.
Okay. Okay, that's nice, because I've read we shouldn't plant in tree pits because the trees need all that water. But I'm glad.
No, don't worry about it. They'll be fine.
Maybe I'll plant something in the tree pit in front of our building. Okay, I think we have hit all the questions that people sent in ahead of time. So now, if Lisa and Jennifer and George and Gail, if you have questions you want to type in the chat, or I'll even unmute you now, and you can ask your question.
Oh, I have a few. Thank you so much, by the way. This has been really helpful. I want to go back. I have a couple questions I wrote down about, I'm like so entranced by all the elephant ears and what are the other things that look like that? The like tropical looking plants that people seem to have all over the place right now. And is that really what they're all doing? They're like digging them up and bring them inside for the winter? Or, I mean, if you have room, if it's in a pot, can you just bring the pot in and let it be like an indoor plant in the winter? Or
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So if your elephant ear or alocasia or colocasia is growing in a pot outside, you can bring it inside and keep it in that same pot and just keep watering it all winter. You should get a tray so that the pot is sitting in a tray, because every time you water the plant, you want the water to flow through to the bottom of the tray that the water is.
And what if, yeah.
Another thing you can
Yeah.
Another thing you can do is get a humidifier, because because again, in the New York apartments in the winter, as soon as these radiators kick on, like in my apartment, I have steam heat and it just gets super dry. So get a humidifier and put it right next to that alocasia or colocasia or whatever you have, to kind of try and mimic its natural environment, and put it in the sunniest spot you have.
But all the ones that I'm seeing come up around town right now, those aren't just like somebody's dealing. They were either planted in the spring or they were kept year to year, but they're not like perennials that just come up without any care year after year.
No. And
No.
I would assume that most people are just throwing them away when it gets.
So they're buying them in the spring. They're planting them in the spring, letting them, and then they buy a new one each year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, when they buy them in the spring, they pay $100. And it lasts for May, June, July, August, September into October. So they're getting 6 months for their $100, which is not bad. A lot of people do that.
Or you can just go through, or you can go through. I don't have any of those. I would like to learn how to plant it. So if I do it next spring, then maybe I would save it through the winter or something, the way you described. So
if you have room in your apartment.
Just bring it inside, you mean?
Yeah, I was actually the other day, I was working for one of my clients she loves me that she has these two big, beautiful pots, and every spring I plant big, beautiful tropical plants in her pots. And I was just there yesterday, and it was time to kind of get rid of the plants. And so she doesn't want to keep them. That's just how it is. She just likes to have them outside during the summer. And so I brought them home, and I'm going to give them to some friends, and they're going to keep them as houseplants.
Oh, cool. One other question I wanted to ask you about, oh yeah, are there any other like nurseries or plant sources you recommend, either like nurseries in town or online ordering places?
So a lot of people order their plants online. I don't really like doing that unless it's bulbs. You can order your bulbs online, but plants, when they send them to you, it's like in cardboard box for who knows how
Yeah.
long. So when you're buying plants, I always tell people go to the nursery. If you have a car, get out onto Long Island because the prices are going to be way better. Here in Brooklyn, in general, the nursery is expensive. The good nursery to go out to in Long Island is called Hicks. They have a pretty big selection. In the neighborhood, I really like the plant palette that they have at the Gowanus nursery. They have beautiful stuff there. It's always fun to go down to 28th Street in Manhattan to check out the different plants that they're selling there to the flower district. You can also, sometimes you can get lucky at Home Depot or Lowe's, but the quality is really hit or miss. You could go to Chelsea Garden Center in Red Hook. So there's a lot of different places. But if you have a car, get in your car and go out to Long Island.
Okay, that's really good
if you're
advice.
going to do like a big planting project for your whole entire garden, it's much better to rent a van if you don't have a car and just make a day of it and get everything you need, bring it back, and then return the van at the end of the day.
I know we're getting really granular also. Then do you have a recommendation for container, like large containers? And I appreciate you. Yeah, I'm like,
Yeah, no problem.
where do you get that
For
kind of
large
stuff?
containers, you can also on 28th Street, there's a couple stores. There's one in particular that all they sell is different types of containers and pots,
Oh,
and they have
wow.
a huge selection. And if they don't have what you're looking for, they can order it for you.
Oh, wow. Cool. That's good to know.
You should definitely check out 28th Street for pots because it's hard to buy pots online because it's like hard to get a feel for how big it is and the shape.
Totally.
And then if you're like buying a pot that's like large, and it's hard, the shipping costs are crazy. So I'm not really an online shopper. I know it's like 2021, everyone's buying everything online. I've never been that person. I like to see things and feel them and touch them. But again, if you go out to that place I mentioned before, Hicks, they also have a pretty good selection of pots. But 28th Street is really cool. There's there are a lot of specialty stores. Like there's the store that only sells fake plants, and there's a store that only sells different types of containers, and there's the store that only sells vases. You know what I mean? So it's really interesting to go there. If you do go there, try to go earlier in the morning because a lot of the stuff closes like around 1 or 2 o'clock.
Okay. 28th Street around what avenues?
It's 28th Street, like between 6th and 7th Avenue, I think.
Okay. Great. I have a question. I try to stay on top of watering, but if something dries out, I find that it's really hard to get the water to soak into the dirt after it dries out. Is there something I can do to help that? Because then the water runs down the
I've
side
also
of
found
the
that when
pond.
soil dries out, if you water it, the water just runs off of the dry soil.
Yeah.
And what I found is that by installing drip irrigation, when the water is dripping very slowly, the emitters that I like to use drip at a rate of 1 gallon per hour. It doesn't tend to run off. So maybe if you don't have an irrigation system, Dorothy, maybe you can like put the hose out there and just leave it dripping very, very slowly, but like leave it on all day. If we were in California, I probably wouldn't be telling you that, but here in New York, where we have enough water, it's okay to do stuff like that.
Okay. I'm doing all containers because my patio is totally paved.
Say that again, Dorothy. I can't hear you.
Everything I do is in containers because my patio is all paved. But can you do drip irrigation in containers, or would
Yeah,
I just?
definitely.
Okay. Okay.
And I actually, like, in gardens, if I have a new client who wants to hire me, I actually refuse to do on a terrace. I refuse to do any planting unless there is an irrigation system.
Oh,
And
okay.
they're pretty, if you're like handy, they're actually pretty easy to set up yourself.
Okay.
But if you want to hire someone, I can give you names of different irrigation contractors. There are a lot of different contractors who specialize, believe it or not, in irrigation in New York City.
Okay. Okay. As far as a more low tech route, have you ever used those terracotta watering spikes, or those glass things that you fill with water and turn upside down into the containers?
I've seen people do that. I've never done it myself, but
Okay.
it's better than nothing, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Are there questions coming in? No questions, but people are chatting comments. Any more questions? Oh, sorry, Lisa. I'm trying to unmute you. Do you want to chat your question? I type all day. Why not stop now? Okay. I've been sending you messages to try to unmute you. I'm not sure how to do it. I sent another message trying to unmute.
There we go.
Hey.
Someone is typing incredibly loudly, and I know it's not me.
Oh,
I can't tell what the noise
They're
is.
really really good
like,
typers.
It sounds like horses.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you answer Jennifer's question? Because I didn't really actually have a question. I just like being conversational.
Okay.
Well, nice to meet you, Lisa.
It makes it easier for you, because otherwise you're just staring at maybe faces, maybe names. I don't know.
So Jennifer's asking, any special recommendations about planting conifers in containers? Oh,
Special recommendations about planting conifers in containers. Make sure there's good drainage. So make sure there's some kind of drainage layer, whether that's gravel or lava rock. I like to use styrofoam packing peanuts at the bottom of planters with a layer of landscape fabric, which keeps the soil from clogging the hole at the bottom of the planter. Also, always make sure that there's a drainage hole in whatever planter you're using. And then, again, do some research about the type of soil that your conifer likes. So a lot of evergreens and conifers like acidic soil. So you can buy a type of fertilizer to and yeah, so good drainage.
great. Helpful. Thanks.
Gail and George, I'm trying to unmute you. I don't know why it's not working. But can you try and unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or just type it into the chat? Okay. George is good. Last spring, you mentioned a brand of potting soil that you like, and I lost that name. I wonder if you would recommend.
Sorry, Dorothy, what'd you say?
Last spring, when you did this, you recommended a brand of potting soil, and I cannot find that name. Do you remember what you recommended?
Potting soil I like to use. I like to use Fafford. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Fafard. It's really good. I tend to stay away from the Miracle Grow brand soils.
Mm-hmm.
In general, the stuff that they sell at Home Depot and Lowe's, I stay away from it. But Fafford is usually available. And like to use a mix of potting soil and compost. So I use half potting soil and half compost in most of my plantings.
Okay. And where do you get the Fafford potting soil?
you can call around different nurseries again, like Hicks or Gowanus Nursery or Chelsea Garden Center, are all places to try.
Okay.
Or another place is Shannon Florist and Garden Center over by Greenwood Cemetery. I really like them over there. They always have a ton of soil in their parking lot.
Okay.
Recommendations for bulk soil. So in general, most of the bulk soil, it's hard to do bulk soil here in the city because if they come with a truck, it's like, where are they going to dump it? In the middle of the street or on the sidewalk? Because that is the cheapest way to buy soil. Just like they fill up a truck and then they come and dump it right outside your house. But it, first of all, it blocks the sidewalk. And then how do you get it through your apartment or through your basement and into the backyard? Unless the raised beds are right in front of the house, you'd have to like fill the soil into trash bags and then carry those heavy trash bags to the house. So I always prefer to bring soil in bags. That's just kind of the nature of the beast here in the city. But I think that Kings County Nursery, I think that's what they're called, over like more in the Flatbush area of Brooklyn, I think they do bulk soil deliveries. Yeah, but I like them over at Kings County Nursery too.
Okay.
You guys have any other questions or comments or anything? I hope I covered everything. Honestly, putting in the fall, let me just recap. You want to use an anti-desiccant spray. You want to blow out the irrigation lines. You want to plant bulbs. You want to clean the leaves or not clean the leaves. You want to plant any extra plants. You want to protect your sensitive plants with burlap. You want to store plants that aren't hardy. Prepare your pots for winter so they don't crack. And do some fall pruning. Those are 9 things that I usually do in different gardens to prepare for winter. And then you fly south and you go to the beach to Miami or wherever you go.
Okay. Well, I think that covers all the questions we had and then some extra questions too. I'm sorry if everybody's getting muted. I'm not doing it. I don't know why that's happening. But thank you very much. And
thank you guys for listening and for giving me a little time on your Tuesday night. I appreciate it.
Oh, so do we. We'll do this again in the springtime.
Okay, guys.
Thanks so
you.
much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. See you later.